Anyway, so my feeling is, well, I like accountability, and I realize cops do bad shit. It's not like they're human.
Mhm.
They're like us.
They're people.
They can do
Yeah.
bad stuff. They can do it negligently. They can do it recklessly. They can do it intentionally. Um, if we add yet another layer of danger for them out there, because they're already overseen by the media, by remnants of Eric Holder's Department of Justice. Now Biden's Department of Justice is going to put a bunch of layers in there where they seize control over all these municipalities and their police forces. They're going to hold back. I feel like that Micaiah Bryant would have been allowed to stab the girl in the pink jumpsuit if qualified immunity were removed, because cops, they don't get paid enough to take those risks, to put their family at risk, to put their job at risk. The George Floyd quote Justice Act also wants to make it a lot easier to put cops in jail for misjudgments on the scene, right? If they've basically they want to lower the standard of culpability for criminality against cops. That too, if I'm a cop, I'm like, go ahead, kill each other. I'm going to be over here. I'm going to make a showing of trying to protect you and let the chips fall where they may. That's what worries me. I'll let you guys take it.
I don't think that it's very easy to have an instrumental sort of consequentialist look at any given police reform, right? If you, for instance, empty the prison of people serving drug sentences for stuff that would now be legal, that they wouldn't be arrested for. Like if you emptied all of the prisons with those people who are currently in jail, some of them are going to commit crimes.
Mm-hmm.
So do we not do it because some of them are going to commit crimes tomorrow? No, I think we do it because that is the just thing to do. Similarly, in this case, I don't think that police or anybody should have a special, judicially created carve out preventing them from being sued as another person in that situation would be sued. So it just doesn't make sense.
Let me challenge you on that, and then I'll be quiet. But even given the nature of what a police officer does, because that's why it came about. Like they're looking at cops like the guy in Micaiah Bryant, who in one split second has got to make a judgment call and can't be worried about qualified immunity. They're going to take it away. I'm going to get sued and lose my. He can't. He's just got to make a split second judgment call, life or death.
Yeah, I don't think that anybody. I don't think you're going to. Qualified immunity is not going to affect that case. Mm-hmm. Nobody's going to look at that case and say, "Oh, that was a bad shot."
Really?
That's not going to. I don't
take it up with Megyn. Take it up with old Megyn. What's her name from Moxie Mouth?
Megyn from Moxie Mouth. Like a lot of people,
she's always screwing things up. Megyn from Moxie Mouth
has a lot of ideas that don't really play out in the real world. Just as Camille was mentioning before in the Derek Chauvin trial, the media has portrayed this as a race thing. The trial didn't at all. So where the real stuff happens, it's not like that. Megyn, you point out the kind of, we're already getting the federal government too involved in these things. That might be true, might not be true. Let's table that for a second. But the majority of all of this activity, just as it is with schools, happens in the local level. These are decisions made. These are local police forces, the Albuquerque, New Mexico police force. Actually, New Mexico just abolished qualified immunity, which I think will be a positive based on how bad the Albuquerque police force has been historically over the years. Really has been involved in a horrific number of killings. But I don't think that the federal government is going to suddenly go everywhere marauding into local police forces. Most of the stuff happens locally. And
they're doing it. They're starting.
They're starting.
They are starting. National Review, right? This is camel's nose under the tent. Here they go. They're already going to do pattern practice. They're going to do it. They're going to do it in Minneapolis. Which will come as a surprise to Madaria Arredondo, right? That was his name. That's the city's first black police chief. The guy was a star witness in the Chauvin trial for the prosecution. He was a guy who he was an Obama-style progressive police officer who came onto that stand and said Chauvin did wrong. Chauvin wasn't taught to do that stuff. We're against Chauvin. And now he's going to have the feds breathing down his neck saying, pattern and practice, you're going to have to answer to. This guy's probably like, what? As you guys put it on your podcast, if they had the evidence of that, we would have heard it already. They don't. But this is what the Obama-Biden administration and now Biden-Harris administration wants to do. They want to go in there. They want to take policing out of the local control and give it a more federalized feel, which does not work. That is not going to end well. You can't police that way. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think nationalizing policing is the answer.
Yeah.
And I will say that there does seem to be, at least from a cultural standpoint, a bit of a pendulum that is swung in the other direction in terms of public opinion about encounters like this. I'm surprised to see so many people publicly effectively advocating for kids getting into knife fights and occasionally murdering one another, and the police just not getting involved in firing their guns. And look, we are seeing places locally where qualified immunity has been done away with, and we will very soon see whether or not that leads to good or bad outcomes. My suspicion is that it's going to depend on the circumstances, because all of these things are complex. And that is the reason not to try to take this broad brush, approach to trying to fix all of these things. But it does seem to me that before the pendulum swung, that the pendulum was probably too far in the other direction. There were too many such circumstances where law enforcement was effectively involved in making determinations about the legitimacy of its own actions. And no person in America can agree that when the police shoot someone and kill them, that they should be sort of the actual ones making determinations about whether or not that's okay. But more than that, to bring us back to this same conversation we were having before, the conversation around qualified immunity is mostly about retribution. It's about punishment. And it's not reform oriented, except to say, well, we're aligning incentives. We're trying to get it so that cops are a little more judicious and careful when they're out doing their jobs. Well, let's talk about the specific job they're being asked to do. Maybe there are ways that we can keep our society safe without getting armed agents of the state involved in everything. And those practical conversations, which I think require some deliberateness and some thoughtfulness, and again, a lot of involvement at the local level based on circumstance and need, to try to figure out what those things are. And again, we're not having those conversations because we're too busy screaming at one another, chasing after imaginary white supremacists who are likely to take over the country and kill everyone if we apparently stop talking about them. So I think there are lots of opportunities for reform here, and probably lots of opportunities for actual compromise and progress on a lot of important issues. And I think it's fair to have some concerns about the possibility that qualified immunity, like across the board, might be too much. But it's also a circumstance where we're saying, well, the problem here, the danger that we're talking about, is maybe there would be too much accountability. And I mean, I'd probably rather make that error than the error in the other direction. If I had to choose.
Let me just ask you this. Let me ask you this. So let's say we're not going to get the sweeping qualified immunity that the Democrats want, I think. There's not enough. I don't think they've got the votes in the Senate for that. Tim Scott's version, I think that could happen. He actually said in the news the other day that he thinks that they may have a deal on this between 1 and 2 weeks. But the other stuff that's being layered on here by the Democrats and what they want to do to reform police, to your point, they're already looking at a lot. It's not just qualified immunity removal. It's the thing I was saying, like getting rid of any disparities based on your ethnicity, based on your gender, right? Based on your sexual orientation. Like, we need as many gay people pulled over as straight people. I don't know, straight, whatever. That stuff disturbs me, right? Because it's 92% of the U.S. prison population is male. There's a reason for that. Like, men are the ones committing most of the crime. Sorry, guys. That's just the truth. It doesn't mean that, look, all cops are sexist. It's just, I don't know. There's probably a long, long reason for it. And if you watch as much as Dateline as I do, women are the victims. Women are the victims. And it's always the husbands. Okay, I've taken a diversion. But this is the point I was trying to make, that this bill being proposed by Biden, touted last night, would also, I'm now quoting from National Review, funnel federal dollars to progressive organizations like the NAACP, the ACLU, and the National Urban League, among others. And what for? Quote, to study management and operations standards for law enforcement agencies, including use of force, racial profiling, and much more. Then they're supposed to use these studies, which we can safely assume will not be disinterested, so quoting, to create pilot programs for law enforcement that can be used to fulfill their accreditation standards. Cops seeking federal grants must pledge to spend at least 5% of the funds that they get on studying and implementing programs like those the NAACP, the ACLU, and et cetera are charged with coming up with. Can you imagine? They got to get their money, they've got to pledge 5% of what they're given on implementing plans they get from the NAACP and the ACLU, who, if you look at some of the police reform positions they push, I mean, it's like not that far afield from what we see from BLM. Like, who the hell's going to know how to police after this other than, excuse me, ma'am, did you not want that knife plunged into you? How about you? Could I get you to stop? Oh, wait, the knife's already in. It's already in. You know, that's how it's going to go.
Yeah. I mean, the risk of getting these people involved in this particular way is that you just end up with a circumstance where this is a rich opportunity for highly paid consultants. Like, they're going to make a tremendous amount of money, whether or not there's any material progress made on these issues. In fact, it's in their interest that there isn't material progress made on these issues, that they perpetuate it forever to maintain that their stream of income. And again, that's not the way we get to progress, which is the reason why it probably isn't even a good thing for Black Lives Matter to necessarily be up in arms about what's happening in Chicago. What really needs to happen is all of us need to be collectively a little less inured to the carnage that's taking place in various parts of America, and a bit more compassionate and a bit more thoughtful about the ways that we can get to solutions, and stop thinking about this in terms of black and white. That conversations about black on black crime always make my skin crawl. Like, most Black people aren't committing crime. People aren't committing crime on account of their Blackness. They're not committing it on behalf of Black people. Like, the fact that it's black on black doesn't interest me at all, because I don't wish it were black on white. The only issue I'm interested in is it's crime. It's criminality. And maybe there are commonalities amongst criminals of any background. And perhaps some of those commonalities might lead us to practical solutions, which, talking about those things narrowly, is probably the best path forward.
It's too rare that people think about the federal government, of what it can and should do, of like, well, let's create a thing and let's do it money. And what it can and should do, especially in the area of criminal justice reform, is undo the bad things it already has. Right? Like, it's the federal government that, basically created civil asset forfeiture, for example, legalized theft by local police or whatever police of goods that they presume are stolen, and they can keep it. They don't have to charge anybody with a crime. This is a federal government created thing. They could remove the thing. That would be helpful.
Yeah.
The federal government created the drug war, essentially, right? There were state and local marijuana laws and other things, but the federal government got in there. So, like, let's get rid of those things that are there. That will do so much more good than hiring a bunch of consultants.
Well, yes. And why do we have to, like, they arrest so many people? Like, that's the thing about the George Floyd trial that always sort of stuck out at me. Like, I realize he resisted arrest once they decided to arrest him, but like, it was a counterfeit $20 bill. Like, okay, he was sitting behind the wheel of a car and there were drugs in the car. I get all of that, but like, could there be some other version of handling that wouldn't have resulted in handcuffs, resisting, knee on the neck? You know what I mean? Like, it does seem, when you have somebody who's in the course of committing what you believe is a nonviolent offense, that we should be able to come up with other options, because cops hands-on Black suspects is risky. It just doesn't, it goes wrong too often. And if you can decrease the number of times that happens, both by looking at the cops' options and yes, the Black crime rate, then you should.
Yeah, although I just warn again about making it about race in the context of these things, just only because we've become so comfortable with doing it.
Here's where I want. Here's why I raise that. Okay, and I'll give you the floor of this. So, and my audience knows, like, I am somebody who, I don't tweet out random videos of Black crime. I feel like there's something wrong about it. I don't do it. I see people do it all the time. I'm not trying to make a point about Blacks, committing Black on Black crime more than police do, although that is an issue. But I went to Chicago and I did some really tough interviews in inner city Chicago a couple of years ago, and tried to get to the bottom of, I met with a bunch of moms who had lost sons to gun violence or to, prison sentences. And there was such a sense of hopelessness. They didn't want to leave. They did not want to leave the inner city. This is their home. It's where all their friends are, their families. But they wanted things to be better. There weren't fathers in the homes most of the time. There were drive-by shootings all the time. These kids were spending their entire days inside because it wasn't safe to go outside. They couldn't go across certain streets in the town because of the gang violence, and they understood like where they were supposed to stay, or if they crossed over to this other area, that was the most dangerous part because they weren't affiliated with the right gang. And these are moms; they're not in the gangs at all, but they just understand sort of territories have been carved out. The schools are nothing. The schools suck. The schools do nothing for these kids. And
Mhm.
they've been given a lot of federal money. I don't know where it goes, why it doesn't work, but it doesn't. The schools themselves are dilapidated, far from inspirational. They're depressing. And the kids see no examples of a good future for them, right? It's like we have to get to these communities so much earlier than the point at which they meet the police. Charlie Cook was making this point the other day. And there just doesn't seem any appetite to do it. So it's not just like, oh, the black people are killing the black people. It's like these communities are ignored,
Mhm.
or there's something happening inside of them that needs to be addressed much, much earlier. And I feel like we don't hear that highlighted enough as something we need to dig into.
I think
Go ahead.
I think you're yeah. So first, I'll begin by saying, I mean, I appreciate the genuine compassion on your part towards a community that you do not reside in, right? Not that you're not a part of because you're too white, but because you don't live there. You know, this is something
Right.
that you see from afar. Your kids aren't exposed to it. Neither are mine. And the principal issue that I have with our descriptions of these things being rooted in our descriptions of things along like racial lines is the universe of really complicated, interconnected problems that you just described. Most of the things that you talked about, race is just not consequential there. And it might be a common characteristic amongst the people who live in that particular region. But the actual sort of patterns of dysfunction, the institutions that are failing people, the ways in which they're failing them have nothing to do with race. And there is a universe of people who kind of look like them, who don't have their life experience, who don't share those particular risks. And there is literally no advantage in us sort of classifying and codifying things in a way that effectively like takes what is the characteristic of the victims in these communities. People who live in high crime communities are the victims of the criminals who are operating around them, who are committing theft,
very
who
much.
are committing vandalism, who are killing people. And the difficulty with black on black crime or even white on white crime in regions of the country where that is, you know, the particular problem, like it is a weird way of kind of characterizing or categorizing the horrible circumstances they're dealing with respect to the physical attributes of the people who live in those neighborhoods that doesn't actually give me anything actionable. There's nothing about it that helps me wrap my hands around the circumstances. It gives us this veneer of understanding. And I think it's a dangerous veneer of understanding.
Have you seen Shelby and Eli Steele's What Killed Michael Brown?
I have, yeah.
So they came on the show and they posited that in a city like Ferguson, Missouri, what created sort of an area that's got a lot of crime is the federal government. That the black community, they were focused on the race of, you know, the dominant population in that city, saying they were on the rise, like the marriage rate, the home ownership rate, the job rate was on the rise.
Comes up a lot, sure.
Yeah, and then the feds got involved, the Great Society, and so on, and they created what Eli said was a permanent black underclass there with federal housing that was awful, that fell apart, and so on, and sort of went back to look at the root causes in a city like Ferguson of why there's so much poverty, which is directly linked to crime, right? I don't know. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's not relevant at all. What I took away from that conversation in that film was the federal government's effort to, quote, help very often has the opposite effect. And then when things go wrong, now in today's day and age, people scream racism, but that's not necessarily an honest assessment of how we got to where we got.
No, I mean, I think that race so often distorts rather than illuminates. And one kind of tangential point here, and a related point, is that when you tell people, I mean, the police are in certain neighborhoods because they're getting calls from those neighborhoods, but they want the police to come because most, as Camille says, you know, most black people are not committing crime. Most black people are not X, Y, and Z that you would you know, stereotypically racist people would suggest. So they don't want that in their neighborhood. And if you go back historically, and this is a major blind spot, and people become, you know, baffled by this when you say. So it was mentioned today that, you know, Joe Biden, you know, talks about mass incarceration and has some responsibility there, right? And he's been criticized for this too. And that is presumed to be, well, you know, the old racist Joe Biden is now become the new woke Joe Biden. Well, no, because if you look back, particularly like the Rockefeller drug laws in New York, there's a fantastic book on this called The Black Silent Majority about how those were pushed by black people in those neighborhoods because they thought the liberal policies of, you know, John Lindsay in New York City in the 1960s failed them. And so we needed these laws because it's tearing apart our community and the presumption of a racial motive that you guys don't care. The second version of that is the crack cocaine disparity in sentencing. And that was pushed very heavily by people that were part of the Congressional Black Caucus, because they said there is the crack, what was the word always used afterward? Epidemic.
Yeah.
It was the crack epidemic, and you don't care. We need to get tough on people who are selling drugs in our neighborhood, taking drugs brazenly and openly in the street, and to do something about it. And when we talk about, over incarceration, mass incarceration, sentencing disparities, et cetera, and we talk about it through an explicitly racial lens, we miss the actual truth of what happened.
Yeah.
And this is always obscuring things rather than enlightening
Charlie Rangel was advocating for the death penalty.
You got to kill the bull
in New York because they were destroying Black communities.
Yes. Yeah.
So talk about tough on crime. Again, it's just that there are. I think I've seen Shelby's documentary. I can appreciate some of the arguments that are made there, a lot of the arguments that are made there. I think it's fair to have conversations about cultural defects, cultural proclivities that might lead to bad outcomes. This is fair. I think it's fair to have conversations about the unintended consequences of government policy. What I think is unhelpful generally is to categorize it as, well, it's Black culture that's deficient, or even to call it a poverty of culture. I just think these concepts are too imprecise, and quite frankly, because of our experience with them, they kind of overload our circuitry. We just get distracted by race in these contexts, and I think all it helps to do is compound error. When people presume that the bad things are only happening because of race, or that the bad thing that's happening here is being perpetrated by people of a particular race, and I'm not saying that anyone here is involved in that sort of thinking, just in general, that binary exists in the world. Like we're having the conversation on the wrong plane, and we need to be about 2 or 3 levels deeper than that if we want to get serious.
Part of the problem. I get that. And I like that. I mean, it's sort of falling into the same trap of seeing everything through that racial lens. And I'm going back to sort of the like the Thomas Chatterton Williams unlearning race, like unlearn it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Let me shift gears with you guys for a minute, because something